Sometimes the smallest acts of courage ripple outward in ways we never expect. No one could have predicted that a single moment of instinct would unravel years of carefully constructed walls, transform a company's culture, and prove that heroism often wears the most ordinary faces. What started as one man's split-second decision to dive into dark water would become a story of redemption, forgiveness, and the kind of love that changes everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October rain drummed against the windshield of Marcus Chen's rusted Honda Civic as he navigated the winding roads toward Clearwater Corporate Park. His wipers squeaked in protest, leaving streaks across the glass that made the world look even more distorted than it already felt. He was running late again, which meant another black mark in his supervisor's notebook, another reason for the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered the break room. Marcus had been working the night maintenance shift at Hartwell Industries for 8 months now, ever since his world collapsed like a house of cards in a windstorm. The janitorial work paid barely enough to cover his studio apartment and the mountain of legal fees that followed him like shadows. But it was honest work, and after everything that had happened, honest work was all he had left. His hands, once steady enough to perform delicate electrical repairs, now pushed mops and emptied trash cans. His reputation, once solid enough to build a small contracting business upon, now existed only in the whispered warnings passed between former clients, who crossed the street when they saw him coming. The company headquarters loomed ahead through the rain, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that reflected the storm clouds gathering overhead. Even in the downpour, the building managed to look pristine, untouchable, a monument to success that felt like a rebuke to his own failures. Marcus pulled into the employee parking lot, his car sputtering to a stop in the farthest corner where the newer vehicles wouldn't have to acknowledge its existence. He sat for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, watching the rain cascade down his windshield in rivers that seemed to mirror the path his life had taken over the past 2 years. The divorce papers were still fresh in his memory, signed just 6 months ago when Sarah finally gave up waiting for him to become the man she'd married. The custody arrangement allowed him to see Emma every other weekend, supervised visits that felt more like performances than the natural father-daughter relationship they'd once shared. The security guard barely looked up when Marcus badged in through the service entrance. The night shift was a different world from the bustling daytime operations inhabited by people who worked in the shadows, cleaning up after the success of others. Marcus preferred it this way. The fewer people who recognized him, the better. He'd learned to keep his head down, do his work, and count the hours until he could return to his empty apartment and the silence that had become his most constant companion. His route tonight took him through the executive floors, something he usually tried to avoid. The mahogany-paneled corridors and oil paintings felt like museum pieces, beautiful but untouchable, reminders of a world he'd once imagined joining before his mistakes burned that bridge to ash. He pushed his cart quietly past the corner office, the one with the nameplate that read Victoria Hartwell, Chief Executive Officer. Even at 10 o'clock at night, light spilled from beneath her door. The woman who owned this empire, apparently, didn't believe in normal business hours. Marcus had never met Victoria Hartwell face to face, though he'd heard enough whispered conversations in break rooms and supply closets to piece together fragments of her story. Young for a CEO, brilliant, demanding and utterly focused on maintaining the company her father had built from nothing. Some called her ruthless, others used words like visionary. The custodial staff spoke of her with a mixture of respect and fear, the way people might discuss a force of nature. He was emptying the trash in the adjacent conference room when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the sterile quiet of the executive floor. A child's voice, high and desperate, calling out through the rain-muffled night. Marcus froze, his hands stilling on the garbage bin liner. The sound came again, clearer this time, carrying the unmistakable edge of panic. Marcus abandoned his cart and moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the company's grounds. The landscaped courtyard below was barely visible through the storm, but movement caught his eye near the ornamental pond that served as the centerpiece of the corporate campus. The pond was supposed to be decorative, shallow, designed more for its aesthetic appeal than any practical purpose. But the recent rains had swollen it beyond its normal boundaries, and what he saw below made his blood run cold. A small figure, thrashed in the dark water, arms flailing in the desperate, uncoordinated movements of someone who couldn't swim. Even from 4 stories up, through rain and darkness, Marcus could see that whoever was down there was losing the fight against the water. Without thinking, without calculating the consequences or considering his position, Marcus ran. He took the stairs 3 at a time, his work boots slipping on the polished concrete, his heart hammering against his ribs with a rhythm that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with the image burned into his mind of a child drowning. While he stood by and watched, the emergency exit alarm shrieked as he burst through the door into the storm, but the sound was swallowed by wind and rain. The pond was deeper than it looked from above, fed by runoff from the storm that had been building all day. The child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, had somehow fallen in and was now fighting a losing battle against water that was over her head. Her dark hair was plastered to her skull, her small hands clawing at the surface in movements that were growing weaker by the second. Marcus didn't hesitate. He kicked off his boots and dove in fully clothed, the shock of cold water driving the breath from his lungs. The pond was murky with stirred sediment, and the rain on the surface made visibility almost impossible. He swam toward where he'd last seen the girl, his clothes dragging at him like anchors, his lungs burning with the need for air. His searching hands found her just as she slipped beneath the surface for what might have been the last time. She was tiny, bird-like in his grasp, and terrifyingly still. Marcus wrapped one arm around her chest and kicked toward the surface, breaking through into the chaos of wind and rain with both of them gasping for air. Getting to the edge of the pond was harder than reaching her had been. The girl was conscious but barely responsive, coughing up water and shivering violently against his chest. The stone rim of the pond was slick with rain, offering no easy handhold, and Marcus's waterlogged clothes felt like they weighed 100 pounds. He managed to boost the girl up onto the rim, then hauled himself out after her, both of them collapsing onto the manicured grass as the storm raged around them. The girl was breathing, which was the only thing that mattered, but her lips were blue with cold and shock, and she was shaking so hard her teeth chattered like castanets. Marcus shrugged out of his soaked maintenance uniform shirt and wrapped it around her shoulders, gathering her into his arms as he looked around desperately for help. That's when he saw her, running across the courtyard through the rain like an avenging angel, her long dark hair streaming behind her, her business suit already soaked through. Even in the chaos of the moment, even through the distortion of rain and adrenaline, Marcus recognized her from the photographs that hung in the lobby. Victoria Hartwell moved with the kind of purposeful grace that spoke of someone accustomed to taking control of any situation, but there was something raw and desperate in the way she ran toward them that spoke of fear rather than authority. She dropped to her knees beside them without regard for her expensive clothes or the mud that immediately stained her skirt. Her hands reached for the girl with a tenderness that seemed at odds with her reputation, fingers checking for injuries, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had dealt with childhood emergencies before. "Sophie," she whispered, and the name came out like a prayer. "Oh God, Sophie, what were you doing out here?" The child, Sophie, leaned into the woman's touch with the instinctive trust of a daughter seeking comfort from her mother. Through chattering teeth, she managed to whisper, "I dropped Mr. Buttons in the water. I was trying to get him back." Victoria's eyes swept the pond's surface, and Marcus followed her gaze to see a small, stuffed animal floating near the far edge, a tidy, bedraggled teddy bear that had clearly been well loved. The sight of it, this child's treasured companion floating just out of reach, explained everything. A toy that had seemed worth risking everything to save, until the water proved deeper and more dangerous than a 7-year-old could understand. "We'll get him," Victoria said, her voice steady despite the tears that mixed with raindrops on her cheeks. "But first, we need to get you warm and dry." It was only then that her eyes met Marcus's, and he saw recognition flicker across her features. Not personal recognition, but the awareness that he was an employee, someone she should know but didn't, someone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Ms. Hartwell," Peterson said carefully, "we got an alarm from the east exit. Is everything all right?" Victoria stood slowly, lifting Sophie into her arms as she did. The child wrapped her legs around her mother's waist and buried her face in Victoria's neck, seeking warmth and comfort. "My daughter fell into the pond," Victoria said, her voice steadying as she shifted into crisis management mode. "This man saved her life." Peterson's gaze shifted to Marcus, taking in his wet clothes and employee badge. There would be questions later, Marcus knew. Security would want to understand how a night shift janitor had ended up in the executive courtyard at the exact moment Victoria Hartwell's daughter needed rescuing. But for now, Peterson simply nodded and spoke into his radio, calling for medical assistance and maintenance to secure the area. "We should get her to a hospital," Marcus said quietly, his first words since pulling Sophie from the water. "She swallowed some water, and hypothermia is a real concern." Victoria studied him with new interest, as if hearing something in his voice that didn't match his current occupation. "You have medical training?" "Some," Marcus said, which was true but incomplete. Before his world fell apart, before the failed business and devastating divorce, he'd been a volunteer EMT with the local fire department. It was knowledge he'd hoped never to need again, but tonight he was grateful for every hour of training he'd received. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their ambulance cutting through the storm with flashing lights that painted the courtyard in alternating waves of red and blue. They were efficient and thorough, checking Sophie's vital signs, wrapping her in warm blankets, starting an IV line to combat dehydration and shock. Through it all, Victoria never left her daughter's side, holding her hand and whispering reassurances that everything would be okay. As they prepared to transport Sophie to the hospital, Victoria turned back to Marcus. He had retreated slightly, trying to blend back into the shadows where maintenance workers belonged, but her eyes found him anyway. "What's your name?" she asked. "Marcus Chen," he said simply. She extended her hand, a gesture that felt strangely formal given what they'd just been through. "Victoria Hartwell, and this is Sophie." Sophie lifted her head from the gurney where the paramedics had placed her, her eyes finding Marcus's face. "Thank you for saving me," she said, in a small voice that somehow carried across the noise of the storm and the radio chatter of the emergency responders. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with adrenaline, and everything to do with the simple trust in a child's eyes. "You're welcome, sweetheart." As the ambulance pulled away, carrying Victoria and Sophie toward the hospital, Marcus stood alone in the rain, watching the tail lights disappear into the night. The security team was finishing their reports, the courtyard was being secured, and soon the pond would be just another decorative feature, its near tragedy hidden beneath the surface like so many other secrets. Peterson approached him as he prepared to return to his abandoned cleaning cart. "Hell of a thing you did tonight, Chen," the security chief said. "Not many people would have jumped in like that." Marcus shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Anyone would have done the same thing. Peterson's expression suggested he wasn't so sure about that, but he simply nodded and handed Marcus a towel from his patrol vehicle. "You should probably go home, get into some dry clothes. I'll make sure your supervisor knows what happened, that you were handling an emergency situation." The drive home was a blur of rain-slicked streets and replaying images. Marcus kept seeing Sophie's face as she slipped beneath the surface, kept feeling the moment when his searching hands found her in the murky water. He thought about Victoria's expression when she realized what had happened, the way she'd looked at him when she understood that a stranger had risked his own safety to save her daughter. His apartment felt smaller and more cramped than usual when he finally got inside. He peeled off his wet clothes and stood under a hot shower until the water ran cold, trying to wash away the pond's murky residue and the lingering chill that seemed to have settled in his bones. But even as the hot water soothed his muscles, his mind kept returning to the moment when Sophie's small hand had found his, the absolute trust of a child who believed he would keep her safe. Marcus had been drifting through life for months, going through the motions of existence without really living, marking time until he could see Emma again on his allotted weekends. Tonight felt different. Tonight he had mattered. Tonight, his presence in exactly the right place, at exactly the right moment, had meant the difference between life and death for someone's most precious treasure. He didn't sleep much that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in the water, searching for a small body in the darkness, feeling the weight of responsibility for another person's life. But there was something else keeping him awake, something he couldn't quite name. The way Victoria had looked at him in those final moments before the ambulance arrived, as if she was seeing him rather than simply looking through him. The next morning brought crisp autumn sunshine that seemed to mock the previous night's storm. Marcus arrived at work earlier than usual, unsure what to expect. Would there be questions from his supervisor about abandoning his assigned duties? Would security want a more detailed report? Would anyone even remember what had happened once the crisis had passed? The answer came in the form of Peterson appearing at his locker as he changed into his uniform. "Ms. Hartwell wants to see you," the security chief said without preamble. "Her office, 9 o'clock. Marcus felt his stomach drop. He'd been summoned to the principal's office, called to account for his actions in a way that couldn't possibly. And well, is there a problem? Peterson's expression was unreadable. She didn't say, but Chen. He paused, studying Marcus with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Whatever happened last night, whatever brought you to that window at exactly the right moment, I'd say you'd better be ready for things to change. The elevator to the executive floor felt like a ride to his own execution. Marcus adjusted his maintenance uniform for the third time, acutely aware of how out of place he looked among the polished brass fixtures and mahogany panels. His reflection in the elevator's mirrored walls showed a man who belonged in service corridors, not corporate boardrooms. The numbers climbed steadily toward the 24th floor, each soft chime marking another step toward a conversation he couldn't predict. Victoria Hartwell's assistant, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s named Helen, barely glanced up from her computer when he approached her desk. The waiting area outside Victoria's office was a study in understated luxury with leather furniture that probably cost more than Marcus made in 6 months, and abstract paintings that seemed to judge him from their gilt frames. "Mr. Chen," Helen said without looking up, "Ms. Hartwell will see you now." The office beyond the heavy oak doors was everything Marcus had expected and more. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city, while shelves lined with business awards and photographs of Victoria with various political and corporate figures spoke to connections that extended far beyond the walls of Hartwell Industries. The desk itself was a masterpiece of modern design, its surface so pristine it looked like it had never been used for actual work. Victoria stood with her back to the door, silhouetted against the morning light streaming through the windows. She'd traded last night's rain-soaked business suit for a navy blue dress that spoke of boardroom authority, her dark hair pulled back in a style that was both professional and elegant. When she turned to face him, Marcus was struck again by how young she seemed for someone wielding this much power. "Please, sit down," she said, gesturing to one of the chairs arranged in front of her desk. Her voice was steady, controlled, but Marcus caught something underneath that spoke of a sleepless night, spent replaying the same images that had haunted his own dreams. He remained standing, uncomfortable with the intimacy that sitting would imply. "How is Sophie?" Victoria's carefully composed expression softened slightly. "She's fine, physically anyway. The doctors kept her overnight for observation, but there were no complications. She's home now, asking when she can go swimming again." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Children are remarkably resilient." "And Mr. Buttons?" The question surprised her. Marcus could see. She'd probably expected him to ask about his job security, about whether there would be consequences for abandoning his assigned duties to play hero. Instead, he was asking about a waterlogged stuffed animal that had started the whole chain of events. "Rescued this morning by our groundskeeping crew," Victoria said. "Currently in the wash, though I suspect he'll never be quite the same." She paused, studying Marcus with the same intensity she might bring to a complex business proposal. "Sophie asked me to make sure you knew he was safe. She was quite concerned that you might be worried about him." The idea that a 7-year-old girl was thinking about his feelings while recovering from her own trauma hit Marcus harder than he'd expected. Children saw the world differently, he knew. They didn't understand the boundaries that adults constructed around themselves, the walls of class and circumstance that kept people in their proper places. "Mr. Chen," Victoria continued, settling into her chair with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to command, "I find myself in an unusual position. Last night you saved my daughter's life. There's no hyperbole in that statement, no corporate exaggeration. The doctors confirmed that another few minutes in that water and—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Marcus shifted, uncomfortably. Anyone would have done the same thing, would they? Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly. "I've been running this company for 3 years, Mr. Chen. I've learned to read people, to understand their motivations. Most people would have called security or run to get help. You jumped into dark water without knowing how deep it was, without considering your own safety. That's not anyone. That's someone with a particular kind of character." She opened a folder on her desk, and Marcus recognized his employee file. His stomach clenched as he imagined what she was reading there. The background check that had been required for his security clearance would have revealed everything. The failed business, the bankruptcy filing, the messy divorce that had played out in local newspapers when Sarah's lawyer had accused him of financial misconduct. "Your employment application lists your previous occupation as self-employed contractor," Victoria said, her tone carefully neutral. "But that doesn't tell the whole story, does it?" Marcus felt the familiar weight of shame settle on his shoulders. Here it was, the moment when his past would catch up with him again, when the careful distance he'd maintained between his current life and his former mistakes would collapse. "I had an electrical contracting business," he said quietly. "It failed. According to the background check, it didn't just fail. It collapsed spectacularly, taking several clients' deposits with it." Victoria's voice remained steady, but Marcus could hear the subtle shift, the cooling that came when people learned about his mistakes. There were accusations of fraud, though no charges were filed. The accusations were false, Marcus said, meeting her gaze directly. I made poor business decisions, trusted the wrong partner, but I never stole from anyone. Every client eventually got their money back, even if it meant selling everything I owned. Including your house, including my house. The words came out flatter than he'd intended. He told this story so many times to lawyers, judges, creditors, and potential employers that it had taken on a rehearsed quality that stripped away most of the emotion. Victoria closed the file and leaned back in her chair. Your supervisor tells me you're one of the most reliable employees on the night shift. Always on time, work consistently meets standards, no complaints from anyone. He also mentioned that you seem overqualified for the position. Marcus said nothing. What was there to say? That he'd once managed crews of skilled electricians, that he'd bid on million-dollar commercial projects, that he'd been invited to join the local Chamber of Commerce before everything fell apart. Those accomplishments belonged to a different person, someone who'd existed before Marcus learned that success could disappear as quickly as it arrived. I've been thinking about last night, Victoria continued. About timing, about coincidence, about the fact that you happened to be on the executive floor at exactly the moment Sophie needed help. Our security logs show you've never deviated from your assigned route before. What brought you up there? The question hung in the air between them like an accusation. Marcus could see where this was heading, could imagine the corporate paranoia that would paint him as somehow complicit in the events that had unfolded. In Victoria's position, he might have asked the same questions. There was a light on in the conference room, he said finally. Sometimes people leave equipment running, computers, projectors. Part of our job is to check for things like that, turn them off to save energy. But you didn't turn anything off. I heard Sophie calling for help before I got that far. Victoria nodded slowly, as if filing away this piece of information for later analysis. Mr. Chen, I want to offer you a position in our corporate security department. The pay would be substantially better than what you're making now, and the work would make better use of your skills and experience. The offer hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd been prepared for termination, for questions about his motives, for the slow dissolution of the fragile stability he'd built over the past 8 months. He hadn't been prepared for a promotion. I don't understand, he said. It's quite simple. You demonstrated excellent judgment under pressure, quick thinking, and a willingness to put others before yourself. Those are exactly the qualities we look for in security personnel. Victoria's tone was businesslike, but Marcus caught something else underneath, something that sounded almost like gratitude, struggling against professional distance. Ms. Hartwell, I appreciate the offer, but your background shows that you've faced adversity and come through it with your integrity intact. The fraud allegations were investigated and dismissed. The business failure, while unfortunate, doesn't disqualify you from employment. If anything, it suggests someone who understands consequences and learns from mistakes. Marcus stared at her, trying to process this unexpected turn. In his experience, corporate executives didn't offer second chances to failed contractors working the night shift. They certainly didn't promote janitors to security positions based on one act of heroism. There's something else, Victoria said, her voice dropping slightly. Sophie hasn't stopped talking about you. She's constructed an entire narrative around last night, cast you as some kind of guardian angel who appeared exactly when she needed you most. She's asked me at least a dozen times when she can see you again to properly thank you. The image of Sophie asking about him, of a child holding him in her thoughts, stirred something in Marcus that he'd been trying to keep buried. Emma used to ask about him like that, back when he was still allowed unsupervised visits, when their relationship hadn't been poisoned by court-ordered restrictions and his ex-wife's carefully cultivated resentment. "Children don't understand complicated adult situations," Marcus said carefully. "She'll forget about last night soon enough. Will she?" Victoria stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the courtyard where the pond reflected morning sunlight like a mirror. Sophie lost her father when she was 4. Car accident, drunk driver, completely senseless. Since then, it's been just the two of us against the world. She doesn't trust easily, doesn't warm up to strangers, doesn't believe in fairy tales or rescue stories. She turned back to face him, and Marcus saw something vulnerable in her expression, a crack in the professional armor she wore like a second skin. "But she believes in you," Victoria continued. "For reasons I can't entirely explain, she's decided that you're someone safe, someone who can be trusted to keep her from drowning. That kind of trust, from a child who's learned to be cautious about the world, isn't something I can dismiss lightly." Marcus felt the weight of that trust settling on his shoulders like a mantle he wasn't sure he deserved to wear. "Ms. Hartwell, I'm flattered by your offer, but I think there might be some things you don't know about my situation. Such as, I have a daughter of my own, Emma. She's 6 years old, and I only get to see her every other weekend, supervised. Visits because of the circumstances around my divorce. Sarah, my ex-wife, made sure the custody arrangement reflected her opinion of my reliability as a father." Victoria's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, a recognition of shared struggle that crossed the boundaries of employer and employee. "The supervised visits," she said carefully, "are they court-ordered because of allegations of abuse?" "No," Marcus said quickly. "Nothing like that. Sarah's lawyer argued that my financial instability and the stress of the business failure made me an unreliable caretaker. The judge agreed that supervised visits were in Emma's best interest until I could demonstrate stability." "And have you demonstrated stability?" Marcus considered the question seriously. 8 months of steady employment, a clean apartment, bills paid on time, no missed visitation appointments. It wasn't much, but it was something. "I'm working on it," he said. Victoria returned to her desk and picked up his employee file again, studying it with the focused attention she might give to a quarterly earnings report. "Mr. Chen, I'm going to be direct with you, because I don't think either of us has time for corporate politeness. Last night you saved my daughter's life. That creates a debt I can never fully repay, but I can try to balance the scales in whatever small way possible. The security position I'm offering comes with a substantial salary increase, health insurance, and the kind of employment stability that family court judges find reassuring when they review custody arrangements." The implications of her words hit Marcus like a revelation. She wasn't just offering him a better job, she was offering him a path back to his daughter, the steady employment, the clean background check that would come with a security position, the corporate letterhead that would carry weight in legal proceedings. All of it could make the difference between supervised visits and real custody. "Why?" he asked simply. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting to a framed photograph on her desk that Marcus couldn't see from his angle. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested she was sharing something she rarely discussed. "Because I understand what it's like to be a single parent trying to hold everything together with sheer force of will. Because I know what it feels like to have people judge your worthiness as a parent based on circumstances beyond your control. And because Sophie deserves to have heroes in her life who are more than just characters in storybooks." She stood and extended her hand across the desk, a gesture that felt like a contract being offered. "The position starts Monday if you want it. Security training, background clearance upgrade, company car, the whole package. What do you say, Mr. Chen?" Marcus looked at her outstretched hand, thinking about Emma's face when he had to leave her at the end of their allotted visits, thinking about the empty apartment waiting for him every night, thinking about the careful distance he'd maintained from hope for so long that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like. He reached out and shook Victoria's hand, feeling the firm grip of someone accustomed to making deals that changed lives. "I say thank you, Ms. Hartwell. I won't let you down." "I know you won't," she said, and something in her tone suggested she meant it. "Helen will get you set up with HR for the paperwork. Your last day on the night shift is Friday, and you start in security on Monday morning." Marcus nodded, still trying to process the speed with which his life was changing. Yesterday, he'd been invisible, just another face in the army of service workers who kept the corporate world running. Today, he was being offered a chance at redemption, at stability, at the possibility of being the kind of father Emma deserved. As he turned to leave, Victoria's voice stopped him at the door. "Mr. Chen, Sophie asked if you might like to join us for dinner sometime. Nothing formal, just pizza and a chance for her to properly thank her hero. I told her I'd ask." Marcus felt something warm and unfamiliar stirring in his chest, something that might have been hope if he'd been brave enough to name it. "I'd like that," he said. "I'd like that very much." And the elevator ride down felt different this time, lighter somehow, as if the weight he'd been carrying for months had shifted just enough to let him breathe freely. The maintenance uniform he wore suddenly felt like a costume he was ready to shed, a disguise he'd used to hide from the world while he figured out how to live again. Peterson was waiting for him when he reached the security office, a knowing smile on the older man's weathered face. "So," Peterson said, leaning back in his chair, "I hear congratulations are in order. Word travels fast around here." "Ms. Hartwell called down right after you left her office, wanted to make sure we had everything ready for your transition." Peterson studied Marcus with the appraising look of someone trying to figure out what had just happened. "In 30 years of security work, I've never seen anyone go from night janitor to corporate security in 24 hours. You must have made quite an impression." Marcus thought about Sophie's small hand in his, about Victoria's carefully controlled gratitude, about the way his life had pivoted on a single moment of instinct. "I was just in the right place at the right time," he said. Peterson laughed, a sound rich with experience and skepticism. "Son, I've been in this business long enough to know that being in the right place at the right time is 90% of what separates heroes from bystanders. The other 10% is having the guts to act when the moment comes." He stood and extended his hand, the gesture carrying the weight of professional respect. "Welcome to the team, Chen. I have a feeling things are about to get interesting around here." As Marcus walked to his car that afternoon, the autumn sun warm on his face, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: anticipation for tomorrow. For the first time since his world had collapsed, he had reason to believe that the future might hold something better than mere survival. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. When he opened it, he saw a photo that made his breath catch in his throat. Sophie, clean and dry and smiling, holding a freshly washed Mr. Buttons, with a message in a child's careful handwriting: "Thank you for saving us both." Marcus saved the photo and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his hand lingering over the device as if it contained something precious. Maybe it did. Maybe hope was just as fragile and valuable as the trust of a 7-year-old girl who believed in heroes. The drive home took him past the family court building, where he'd sat through countless hearings about custody arrangements and supervised visits. The imposing brick structure had always felt like a monument to his failures, a place where judges had decided he wasn't quite good enough to be trusted with his own daughter's well-being. Today, for the first time, it looked like just another building. Marcus's first week in corporate security passed in a blur of training sessions, equipment familiarization, and the strange adjustment of wearing a suit to work instead of a maintenance uniform. The transformation felt surreal, like stepping into someone else's life. His new office, though modest by executive standards, had an actual window that looked out over the company parking lot. After months of fluorescent-lit service corridors, natural light felt like luxury. Peterson had assigned him to the day shift, which meant normal human hours for the first time in nearly a year. Marcus found himself waking up before his alarm, energized by work that engaged his mind rather than simply occupying his time. The security protocols were complex but logical. The technology was state-of-the-art, and his colleagues treated him with professional respect rather than the polite invisibility he'd grown accustomed to as a janitor. But the real test came on Friday afternoon, when Peterson called him into the main security office with an expression that suggested trouble brewing. "We've got a situation developing," Peterson said, pulling up surveillance footage on his computer screen. "Take a look at this." The video showed the employee parking garage, shot from multiple angles over the past several days. At first, Marcus couldn't see what had caught Peterson's attention. Then, the security chief pointed to a figure moving. Between the cars, someone who seemed to be checking door handles and peering into windows with practiced efficiency. "Industrial espionage?" Marcus asked. "That's what we thought initially, but watch this." Peterson switched to footage from that morning, zooming in on the suspect's face as he moved under one of the garage's security lights. Marcus recognized him immediately. Danny Reeves, a former employee from the accounting department who'd been terminated 6 months ago for falsifying expense reports. The termination had been messy, involving accusations of theft and threats of legal action that had ultimately been resolved with a non-disclosure agreement. "He's been coming back," Peterson explained. "Always during shift changes when the garage is busy, always dressed like he still works here. Today we caught him actually trying to break into vehicles. Have you confronted him?" Peterson shook his head. "Ms. Hartwell wants this handled delicately. Reeves has been making noise on social media about wrongful termination, painting himself as a whistleblower who was fired for trying to expose corporate corruption. The last thing the company needs is a confrontation in the parking garage that ends up on YouTube." Marcus studied the footage, noting Reeves's movement patterns, the way he timed his visits to avoid security patrols. "What does she want us to do?" "She wants you to handle it." The assignment felt like a test, and Marcus suspected it was intentional. Victoria was giving him a chance to prove himself, to demonstrate that her faith in his abilities extended beyond emergency rescues. The situation required finesse rather than force, exactly the kind of judgment call that separated competent security personnel from mere guards. Marcus spent the weekend researching Danny Reeves, studying his social media profiles, his employment history, and the circumstances that had led to his termination. The picture that emerged was of a man whose life had unraveled in ways that felt uncomfortably familiar. Divorced, struggling financially, convinced that the world had conspired against him. Marcus recognized the anger, the sense of victimization, the desperate need to blame someone else for circumstances that had spiraled beyond control. Monday morning found Marcus waiting in the parking garage at 7:30, positioned near the elevator bank, where Reeves typically made his appearance. The surveillance footage had shown a pattern. The former employee usually arrived during the morning rush when dozens of cars were entering and leaving the garage, providing cover for his activities. At 7:45, Reeves appeared, walking purposefully toward the executive parking section with a confidence that suggested he belonged there. He was older than Marcus had expected, probably in his late 40s, with the soft build of someone who'd spent years behind a desk. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair needed cutting, and there was something desperate in the way he moved that spoke of a man running out of options. Marcus waited until Reeves was bent over the door handle of a silver BMW before making his approach. He kept his movements casual, non-threatening, his hands visible and empty. "Excuse me," Marcus said quietly. "Can I help you with something?" Reeves straightened quickly, his face flushing with the caught-in-the-act embarrassment of someone who knew they were where they shouldn't be. For a moment, Marcus thought he might run, but instead, Reeves lifted his chin with defiant bravado. "I'm just getting something from my car," Reeves said, his voice carrying the artificial confidence of a lie told with practice. "This isn't your car, Danny," Marcus said gently, "and you don't work here anymore." The use of his name seemed to deflate Reeves's pretense. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time he looked directly at Marcus with eyes that held a mixture of shame and desperation. "You don't understand," Reeves said. "They destroyed me. Hartwell and her corporate lawyers, they made sure I'd never work in accounting again. Do you know what it's like to be blacklisted? To have your reputation torn apart over a few $100s in expense reports?" Marcus did know, though his own destruction had been more spectacular and public. The familiar ache of professional humiliation resonated in his chest as he looked at this broken man trying to salvage something from the wreckage of his career. "I know it's hard," Marcus said. "I know it feels like the end of the world when everything falls apart at once." Something in his tone must have registered with Reeves, because the older man's defensive posture softened slightly. "Your security," Reeves said, noting Marcus's badge and professional attire. "You're going to call the police, have me arrested for trespassing." "That's one option," Marcus agreed. "But maybe we should talk first. There's a coffee shop across the street. Why don't you buy me a cup, and we can figure out a better way to handle this?" Reeves stared at him as if he'd suggested something impossible. "You want to have coffee? With me? I want to understand what you're really looking for here, Danny, because I don't think it's spare change from people's cup holders." The coffee shop was a small, independent place that catered to the office workers from the surrounding buildings. Marcus chose a corner table where they could talk without being overheard, watching Reeves fidget with his cup as if he'd forgotten how to make normal conversation. "6 months, Reeves said finally. 6 months since they fired me and I still can't find work. Do you know how many accounting positions I've applied for? How many interviews where they tell me I'm overqualified or my experience doesn't match their needs?" "They're running background checks," Marcus said. "Finding out about the termination." Reeves nodded miserably. "Hartwell Industries has contacts everywhere in this city. One phone call from their HR department, and suddenly I'm unemployable. My wife left me, took the kids, said she couldn't be married to someone who threw away his career over petty theft." Was it petty theft? The question hung between them like a challenge. Reeves stared into his coffee cup, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I falsified some expense reports, claimed meals I didn't eat, mileage I didn't drive, maybe $800 over 6 months. I was behind on my mortgage, my daughter needed dental work, and the money was just sitting there in the expense account." He looked up, meeting Marcus's eyes. "That makes me a thief, doesn't it?" Marcus thought about his own mistakes, the business decisions that had seemed reasonable at the time but had led to devastating consequences. The line between poor judgment and criminal behavior was often thinner than people wanted to believe. "It makes you someone who made bad choices when you were desperate," Marcus said. "The question is what you're going to do about it now." "What can I do? Hartwell destroyed my reputation, made sure I'd never work in my field again. I come to that parking garage because it's the only place I can still feel like I matter, like I'm still the person I used to be." Marcus leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Danny, I'm going to tell you something that might help you understand where I'm coming from. 2 years ago, I had my own business, employed 12 people, had contracts worth millions of dollars. Then I made some bad decisions, trusted the wrong partner, and lost everything. My house, my business, my marriage, my reputation. For a while there, I thought my life was over. Reeves looked up, studying Marcus with new interest. What happened? I stopped fighting what had already happened and started figuring out what came next. I took a job as a night janitor at the same company where I used to bid on electrical contracts. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and it gave me time to figure out who I was when I wasn't defined by my professional success. And now you're in corporate security. Sometimes life gives you a second chance when you least expect it, but you have to be ready to recognize it when it comes. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the morning coffee crowd flowing around them like a river of purposeful energy. Marcus could see Reeves processing what he'd heard, weighing his options against the reality of his situation. "What do you want me to do?" Reeves asked finally. "I want you to stop coming to the parking garage. I want you to delete those social media posts about Hartwell Industries, and I want you to let me help you find a way forward that doesn't involve looking backward." "Help me how?" Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. "There's a guy named Jim Morrison who runs a small accounting firm downtown. He specializes in helping small businesses get back on their feet after financial difficulties. He's not glamorous, and he doesn't pay much, but he gives people second chances." "Why would he hire me?" "Because I'm going to call him and tell him that you're someone who made mistakes, learned from them, and deserves another shot." "Jim's been where you are, Danny. He understands that good people sometimes do stupid things when they're desperate." Reeves stared at the phone number Marcus had written on a napkin. "You do that? After catching me trying to break into cars?" "I do that because I understand what it's like to feel like you've lost everything. And because I think you're a better man than your worst mistakes." The transformation in Reeves's expression was subtle but unmistakable. The defensive anger that had defined his posture since Marcus had approached him in the parking garage began to fade, replaced by something that looked almost like hope. "There's one condition," Marcus continued. "If Jim gives you a chance, you take it seriously. You show up on time, you do the work, and you prove that his faith in you wasn't misplaced. Can you do that?" "Yes," Reeves said. And for the first time since Marcus had met him, his voice carried conviction instead of desperation. "Yes, I can do that." Marcus stood and extended his hand. "Then let's get you a second chance." The handshake felt like a contract, a mutual agreement that the past didn't have to define the future. As they walked back toward the office building, Marcus found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken over the past week. A week ago, he'd been invisible, just another face in the crowd of service workers. Now, he was helping a former corporate adversary rebuild his life. Peterson was waiting in the security office when Marcus returned, his expression expectant. "How did it go with our parking garage problem?" "Resolved," Marcus said. "Reeves won't be coming back." "Did you have to call the police?" "No, it turns out he just needed someone to listen." Peterson raised an eyebrow. "That's it? You talked him out of committing crimes?" Marcus thought about how to explain what had happened in the coffee shop, the moment when anger had transformed into understanding, when punishment had been replaced by possibility. "Sometimes people act out because they don't see any other options," Marcus said. "Once you give them a better path, they usually take it." Peterson nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Ms. Hartwell is going to want a full report. She was concerned about potential media attention, lawsuits, that kind of thing. Tell her the situation has been handled quietly and permanently. No publicity, no legal complications, no ongoing security concerns. And Reeves is going to get a chance to rebuild his life somewhere else. Sometimes that's the best outcome for everyone involved." Later that afternoon, Marcus was reviewing security protocols when Helen, Victoria's assistant, appeared at his office door. "Ms. Hartwell would like to see you," Helen said, "when you have a moment." The elevator ride to the executive floor felt different this time, less like a journey to judgment and more like a routine part of his professional responsibilities. Marcus was beginning to understand that Victoria's management style involved frequent check-ins, personal attention to problems that other executives might delegate to subordinates. She was standing at her window again when he entered her office, but this time she turned immediately to face him, her expression curious rather than guarded. "Peterson tells me you handled the Danny Reeves situation with remarkable diplomacy," she said without preamble. "Care to share the details?" Marcus recounted the morning's events, describing the conversation in the coffee shop and the arrangement he'd made with Jim Morrison's accounting firm. Victoria listened without interruption, her attention focused with the intensity she might bring to a complex business negotiation. "You let him go," she said when he finished. "You could have had him arrested for trespassing, attempted burglary, harassment. Instead, you helped him find a job. I helped him find a way to move forward instead of backward. Sometimes that's more effective than punishment." Victoria moved to her desk and sat down, gesturing for Marcus to take one of the chairs across from her. Danny Reeves cost this company approximately $800 in fraudulent expense claims. But the real cost was the damage to trust, the time spent investigating his activities, the legal fees involved in his termination. By the time we were finished dealing with him, he'd cost us probably 10 times what he actually stole. And now he's someone else's responsibility, with a chance to prove he's learned from his mistakes. If your friend Morrison is willing to take the risk, then Reeves gets his second chance without any ongoing complications for us. Victoria's expression was approving. "That's elegant problem-solving, Mr. Chen." Marcus felt a flush of professional pride, the satisfaction of work well done that he hadn't experienced since the early days of his contracting business. "There's something else," Victoria continued. "Sophie has been asking about that dinner invitation every day since I mentioned it. Would Saturday evening work for you? Nothing formal, just pizza and a chance for her to properly thank her hero." The word hero still felt uncomfortable to Marcus, like a title he hadn't earned, but the thought of seeing Sophie again, of witnessing her recovery from their shared trauma, appealed to him more than he wanted to admit. "Saturday would be perfect," he said. Victoria smiled, the first genuinely warm expression he'd seen from her since that night in the rain. "Good. Sophie will be thrilled. Fair warning, though, she's been practicing a thank you speech that she's quite proud of." As Marcus left Victoria's office, he reflected on how much his world had changed in the span of a single week. He had meaningful work, the respect of his colleagues, and the beginning of something that might eventually become friendship with a woman who had every reason to see him as just another employee. But more than that, he had proved to himself that he was capable of more than just surviving. The Marcus, who had handled Danny Reeves with compassion and wisdom, wasn't the same man who had been cleaning offices and counting the hours until his next supervised visit with Emma. He was becoming someone better, someone worthy of the trust that a 7-year-old girl had placed in him during the darkest moment of her young life. The drive home that evening took him past the family court building again, but this time he barely noticed it. His attention was focused on the future, on Saturday dinner with Sophie and Victoria, on the possibilities that seemed to be opening up like flowers after a long winter. For the first time in years, Marcus Chen was looking forward to tomorrow. Victoria's house sat in the hills overlooking the city, a modern architectural marvel of glass and steel that seemed to float among the oak trees like something from a magazine. Marcus pulled his Honda into the circular driveway, feeling acutely aware of how his modest car looked against the backdrop of understated luxury. The house wasn't ostentatious, but everything about it spoke of success, earned through intelligence and determination, rather than inherited wealth. Sophie answered the door before he could ring the bell, bouncing on her toes with barely contained excitement. She wore a bright yellow dress that made her look like a sunbeam, and her dark hair was pulled back with a ribbon that matched her outfit. The transformation from the frightened child he'd pulled from the pond was remarkable. "Marcus," she exclaimed, then caught herself and attempted a more formal greeting. "I mean, Mr. Chen. Mommy said I should be polite." "Marcus is fine," he said, crouching down to her level. "How are you feeling, Sophie? Any lingering effects from your swimming adventure?" She giggled at his description, covering her mouth with both hands. "Mommy says I'm not allowed to go swimming in ponds anymore, only in pools with lifeguards. But I wasn't really swimming. I was trying to save Mr. Buttons." "Speaking of Mr. Buttons, how is he doing?" Sophie's face lit up. "He's much better. The washing machine made him all fluffy again, and Mommy bought him new clothes because his old ones got torn. Do you want to see him?" Before Marcus could answer, Sophie had grabbed his hand and was leading him into the house. The interior was as impressive as the exterior, with high ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows, and an open floor plan that made the space feel even larger than it was. But despite the architectural grandeur, there were touches everywhere that spoke of a home rather than a showplace. Children's artwork on the refrigerator, books scattered on coffee tables, a pair of small sneakers kicked off by the front door. Victoria emerged from the kitchen wearing jeans and a casual sweater, looking more relaxed than Marcus had ever seen her. Without the armor of business attire, she seemed younger, more approachable, though no less striking. "I hope you're hungry," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Sophie insisted on helping with dinner, which means we have enough pizza to feed a small army and cookies that are only slightly burnt around the edges." "I helped," Sophie announced proudly. "I put the pepperoni on in a pattern, and I stirred the cookie dough, and I set the table with the good plates, because Mommy said you're special company." The phrase, "special company," seemed to hang in the air for a moment, carrying implications that neither adult was quite ready to address. Victoria's cheeks colored slightly, and she busied herself straightening magazines that didn't need straightening. "Well, I'm honored to be special company," Marcus said diplomatically, "and I brought something for the hostess." He handed Sophie a small wrapped package, which she accepted with the reverence children reserved for unexpected gifts. Inside was a waterproof watch designed for young swimmers, with a bright yellow band that matched her dress. "It's so you can time yourself when you're swimming in those pools with lifeguards," Marcus explained. "And it has an emergency whistle just in case." Sophie strapped the watch onto her wrist immediately, admiring how it looked against her small arm. "Look, Mommy, now I can be safe and tell time." Victoria met Marcus's eyes over her daughter's head, and he saw gratitude there that went beyond simple appreciation for a thoughtful gift. The watch was practical, safety-minded, the kind of present that showed he'd been thinking about Sophie's well-being beyond their initial encounter. Dinner was a revelation for Marcus, who had grown accustomed to eating alone in his small apartment or grabbing quick meals between shifts. Sophie kept up a steady stream of chatter, telling him about school, her friends, her favorite books, and her plans to become either a marine biologist or a professional swimmer when she grew up. Victoria contributed to the conversation with the easy warmth of a mother who genuinely enjoyed her daughter's company, adding details and asking follow-up questions that showed she was genuinely interested in Sophie's thoughts and opinions. "Marcus," Sophie said suddenly, interrupting her own story about a classroom hamster named Winston, "do you have any kids?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow, unexpected and sharp. Victoria's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and he could see her watching his reaction carefully. "I do, Marcus said after a moment. "I have a daughter named Emma. She's about your age." "Where is she? Why didn't she come to dinner with you?" Children's directness could be both refreshing and devastating, Marcus reflected. Sophie had no way of knowing that her innocent questions were probing the most painful area of his life. "Emma lives with her mother," Marcus said carefully. "I get to see her sometimes, but not as often as I'd like." Sophie processed this information with the serious consideration children brought to adult complexities they didn't fully understand. "That must make you sad," she said finally. "Sometimes it does," Marcus admitted. "But I'm grateful for the time we do have together." Victoria gently steered the conversation towards safer topics, but Marcus could see her filing away what she'd learned about his situation. The custody arrangement, the careful way he'd phrased his relationship with Emma, the pain that had flickered across his face when Sophie asked her innocent questions. After dinner, Sophie insisted on giving Marcus a tour of the house, proudly showing him her bedroom with its collection of stuffed animals, her playroom with its elaborate dollhouse, and the home theater where she and her mother watched movies, together on weekends. The house was clearly designed with a child in mind, despite its sophisticated aesthetic. Safety features were seamlessly integrated into the design, and every room had spaces where a young girl could play and explore without fear of breaking priceless artifacts. "This is Mommy's office," Sophie said, pushing open the door to a room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a desk that was only slightly smaller than the one in Victoria's corporate office. "She works here sometimes when she can't go to the big building." The office offered another glimpse into Victoria's character. The books ranged from business texts to literary fiction to what appeared to be an extensive collection of children's stories. A corkboard on one wall was covered with Sophie's artwork, school photos, and what looked like vacation snapshots of mother and daughter adventures. "Do you like your job?" Sophie asked Marcus as they made their way back downstairs. "Mommy says you help keep people safe." "I do like it," Marcus said, realizing as he spoke that it was true. "It's nice to have work that feels important, that helps other people." "Like when you helped me in the pond?" "Exactly like that." Sophie nodded, seriously, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected about the nature of heroism and professional responsibility. Victoria was waiting in the living room with coffee for the adults and hot chocolate for Sophie. The evening had taken on a comfortable domesticity that felt both natural and slightly surreal to Marcus. He couldn't remember the last time he'd experienced this kind of easy family interaction, the kind of evening he'd once imagined having regularly when Emma was older. "Sophie has something she wants to share with you," Victoria said, settling onto the couch beside her daughter. Sophie straightened up with the serious expression children wore when preparing to perform something they'd rehearsed. She cleared her throat and began to recite in the careful cadence of memorized words. "Thank you, Marcus, for saving my life when I was scared and in the water. Thank you for being brave when I couldn't be brave. Thank you for making sure Mr. Buttons was safe too. Thank you for being my hero and for having dinner with us and for being Mommy's friend. I hope you can come back soon, because you make Mommy smile more than she used to." The speech was clearly rehearsed, but the emotion behind it was entirely genuine. Marcus felt his throat tighten as Sophie finished her formal thank you and immediately reverted to her normal 7-year-old self, bouncing slightly with pride at having remembered all her words. "That was beautiful, Sophie," Marcus said. "Thank you for taking the time to prepare something so special." "I practiced in the mirror," she confided. "Mommy helped me with the big words." Victoria's cheeks had colored again at Sophie's observation, about smiling more, but she didn't contradict her daughter's assessment. Instead, she suggested it might be time for Sophie to get ready for bed, which prompted the usual childhood negotiations about 5 more minutes and 1 more story. Marcus found himself automatically participating in the bedtime routine, reading one of Sophie's favorite books while she brushed her teeth, listening to her prayers that included a special thank you for new friends, and accepting a good night. Hug that felt both precious and heartbreaking in its trust. "She doesn't warm up to people easily," Victoria said when they were alone in the living room. Sophie's bedroom door closed against the adult conversation that was about to take place. Since her father died, she's been cautious about getting attached to people who might leave. "But she's attached to me," Marcus observed. "She talks about you constantly. Marcus said this, Marcus did that. When can we see Marcus again? I haven't seen her this excited about anyone since." Victoria trailed off, leaving the comparison unfinished. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. The house felt different now that Sophie was asleep, more intimate somehow, as if the child's presence had been providing a buffer between the two adults that was now absent. "Can I ask you something personal?" Victoria said finally. Marcus tensed slightly, preparing for questions about his past, his mistakes, the circumstances that had led him to working night shifts as a janitor. "Your daughter, Emma, the custody situation, is it temporary?" The question was gentler than he'd expected, asked with the careful tone of someone who understood that family situations could be complicated and painful. "I hope so," Marcus said. "The supervised visits are supposed to be reviewed every 6 months. My lawyer thinks that with steady employment and time to demonstrate stability, we might be able to work toward unsupervised visits eventually." "What happened, if you don't mind me asking?" Marcus had told this story so many times to lawyers, social workers, and court-appointed counselors that he'd developed a kind of shorthand version, sanitized and clinical. But sitting in Victoria's living room with Sophie's thank you speech still echoing in his mind, he found himself telling the truth instead. "When my business failed, I went through a very dark period. I wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating properly, wasn't handling stress well. Sarah, my ex-wife, was dealing with her own anxiety about our financial situation, and we started fighting constantly. The fighting escalated, got ugly, said things we couldn't take back." He paused, studying his hands as he continued. "One night, Emma was crying because she could hear us arguing, and I snapped. I didn't hurt anyone, but I put my fist through a wall, scared my own daughter with my anger. Sarah called the police, and even though no charges were filed, it became part of the divorce proceedings. Evidence that I was unstable, potentially dangerous." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus braced himself for the subtle shift in her demeanor, the way people often pulled back when they learned about his failures as a husband and father. Instead, she surprised him. "Anger born from... Desperation is different from anger born from cruelty," she said quietly. "The fact that you recognize the difference, that you're working to change the circumstances that led to it, says something about your character. Sophie trusts you completely," she continued. "Children have good instincts about people. They can sense when someone is safe, when someone genuinely cares about their well-being. I've learned to trust her judgment." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Marcus's phone, buzzing with a text message. He glanced at it automatically, then felt his world shift on its axis as he read the words on the screen. The message was from Sarah's lawyer. "Emergency. Custody hearing scheduled for Monday, 9 a.m. Client alleges violation of visitation agreement and requests supervised visits be suspended pending investigation." Victoria must have seen something in his expression because she set down her coffee cup and leaned forward with concern. "What's wrong?" Marcus handed her the phone, watching her face as she read the message. Her expression shifted from curiosity to professional focus, the same intensity she brought to corporate crises. "What kind of violation could they be alleging?" she asked. "I have no idea," Marcus said, but even as he spoke, a cold realization was settling in his stomach. Unless what? Unless someone told them about the job change, about spending time with you and Sophie. Sarah's been looking for evidence that I'm not focused on rehabilitation, that I'm more interested in starting a new life than in rebuilding my relationship with Emma. Victoria's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger. Are you saying that helping my daughter, accepting a better job, having dinner with us tonight, that those things could be used against you in court? In the wrong context, with the right spin from a hostile lawyer? Yes, absolutely. The evening that had felt so promising just moments ago now seemed like a trap Marcus had walked into with his eyes open. Every moment of happiness, every connection he'd built with Sophie and Victoria could potentially be weaponized against him in his fight to remain part of Emma's life. Victoria stood and began pacing, her business mind clearly working through the implications of what she'd just learned. "This is unacceptable," she said finally. "You saved my daughter's life. I offered you a better position based on your qualifications and character, and now that's being twisted into evidence of irresponsibility. What kind of system allows that?" "A system designed to protect children," Marcus said wearily, "even when it sometimes hurts the very people it's trying to help." Victoria stopped pacing and looked at him directly. "What do you need? Legal representation, character witnesses, documentation of your employment history and performance?" The offer of help was generous and immediate, but Marcus could see the complications it would create. Victoria, testifying on his behalf, would only reinforce the narrative that he was more invested in his new relationships than in his existing responsibilities. "I need to call my lawyer," Marcus said. "Find out exactly what we're dealing with before I make any decisions about how to respond." He stood to leave, the warmth of the evening evaporating under the weight of impending legal battles and potential consequences he hadn't anticipated. "Marcus," Victoria said as he reached the front door, "whatever happens Monday, you did nothing wrong tonight. Being here, caring about Sophie, building a friendship with our family, those are good things, positive signs of a man rebuilding his life. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The drive home gave Marcus too much time to think, to replay every moment of the evening and wonder how it might be interpreted by hostile lawyers and skeptical judges. By the time he reached his apartment, he'd convinced himself that getting close to Victoria and Sophie had been a mistake, a selfish indulgence that might cost him his relationship with Emma. But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and dreading Monday's court appearance, he kept coming back to Sophie's thank you speech and the way Victoria had defended him without hesitation. For the first time in years, he'd found people who saw him as someone worth defending. The question now was whether that was worth fighting for, or whether the smart thing to do was walk away before he lost everything he'd worked so hard to rebuild. The family court building looked different on Monday morning, somehow smaller and less intimidating than Marcus remembered. He sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, his lawyer beside him reviewing last-minute notes while his stomach churned with anxiety that had nothing to do with the legal proceedings and everything to do with the fear of losing what little connection he had left with Emma. David Brennan had been his attorney since the divorce proceedings began, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who specialized in family law and understood the delicate balance between advocating for his clients and maintaining relationships that would have to survive long after the court cases ended. This morning, however, Brennan seemed more tense than usual. "Sarah's lawyer is claiming that your new employment situation represents a pattern of instability," Brennan explained quietly. "They're arguing that constantly changing jobs, moving from janitorial work to corporate security, suggests you're not committed to the kind of steady lifestyle that would be best for Emma." "That's ridiculous," Marcus said. Getting a better job with more responsibility and higher pay should be seen as positive progress. I agree, but they're also raising questions about your relationship with Victoria Hartwell. They're suggesting that you're using your position at her company to gain access to her personally, that your priorities have shifted away from rehabilitation and toward pursuing new romantic relationships. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. The accusation wasn't entirely unfair, though it mischaracterized both his motivations and the nature of his relationship with Victoria. He'd grown closer to her over the past weeks, had found himself looking forward to their conversations about work, about Sophie's progress in school, about the small details of daily life that felt like luxury after months of isolation. "What evidence do they have?" Marcus asked. "Surveillance photos of you entering and leaving Victoria's house on Saturday evening. Social media posts from Sophie's school events where you were apparently present as Victoria's guest. Employment records showing the rapid promotion that they claim was inappropriate given your background." The systematic nature of the investigation shouldn't have surprised Marcus, but it did. Sarah had clearly been building a case for weeks, documenting his every move and interpreting his attempts to rebuild his life as evidence of his unsuitability as a father. "There's something else," Brennan continued. "They're requesting that the supervised visits be suspended entirely pending a full psychological evaluation and investigation into your current living situation and employment circumstances." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Suspended. Visits meant no contact with Emma at all, potentially for months, while bureaucrats and court-appointed experts dissected his life and motivations. It meant missing her 8th birthday, her school Christmas pageant, the countless small moments that formed the foundation of a parent-child relationship. "Mr. Chen?" The bailiff's voice cut through Marcus's spiraling thoughts. "Judge Harrison is ready for you." Judge Patricia Harrison had presided over Marcus's original custody hearing, a woman in her early 60s who had the reputation of being fair but no nonsense. She listened to both sides without visible emotion, asked pointed questions, and made decisions based on legal precedent rather than personal sympathy. Marcus had found her intimidating during the divorce proceedings, but he'd also trusted that she would focus on facts rather than feelings. Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table with her attorney Thomas Wilde, a man whose expensive suit and practiced courtroom manner spoke to his success at painting opposing parties in the worst possible light. Sarah looked older than Marcus remembered, more brittle somehow, though still attractive in the polished way that had first drawn him to her during their college years. She didn't meet his eyes as he took his seat, instead focusing on the legal. Documents spread before her as if they held the answers to questions she'd been asking for years. "Your Honor," Wilde began, rising with the theatrical flourish that Marcus remembered from their divorce proceedings. "We're here today because Mr. Chen has demonstrated a pattern of behavior that calls into question his commitment to the rehabilitation, a process ordered by this court. Rather than focusing on the stability and consistency required for successful co-parenting, he has instead pursued romantic relationships and career opportunities that prioritize his personal desires over his daughter's needs." The opening statement painted Marcus as selfish and irresponsible, a man who had learned nothing from his previous mistakes and was repeating the same patterns that had led to his family's destruction. Wilde presented the surveillance photos with clinical precision, turning Marcus's dinner with Victoria and Sophie into evidence of misplaced priorities and questionable judgment. Mr. Chen was awarded supervised visitation privileges based on his commitment to maintaining steady employment and demonstrating the kind of lifestyle stability that would eventually make unsupervised visits possible. Wilde continued. Instead, We see him job hopping from maintenance work to corporate security, developing inappropriate relationships with his employer, and spending his free time pursuing new romantic interests rather than focusing on the therapy and self-improvement that this court mandated. When it was Brennan's turn to respond, he stood with the quiet dignity that Marcus had learned to appreciate in their attorney-client relationship. Your Honor, the plaintiff's characterization of Mr. Chen's recent life changes is both inaccurate and unfair. Far from demonstrating instability, his promotion to a position of greater responsibility and higher pay represents exactly the kind of positive progress this court hoped to see. His relationship with Ms. Hartwell began when he saved her daughter's life, an act of heroism that speaks to his character and his instincts as a protector of children. Brennan presented his own version of events, describing Marcus's rescue of Sophie, his professional handling of security issues at Hartwell Industries, and his commitment to rebuilding his life in ways that would make him a better father to Emma. The surveillance photos became evidence of a man integrating into a family environment, learning to navigate healthy relationships with both adults and children. As for the allegation that Mr. Chen has prioritized romantic interests over his parental responsibilities, Brennan continued, I would note that his supervised visits with Emma have been consistent and positive. His visitation supervisor's reports consistently describe him as engaged, attentive, and focused entirely on his daughter during their time together. The fact that he has also formed friendships and professional relationships that support his emotional and financial stability should be seen as positive indicators, not red flags. The Judge Harrison listened to both presentations without interruption, occasionally making notes, but giving no indication of her thoughts on the competing narratives being presented. When both attorneys had finished their opening statements, she turned her attention to the evidence itself, studying the surveillance photos, employment records, and visitation reports, with the same careful attention she might give to any complex case. I'd like to hear from Mr. Chen directly, she said. Finally, Mr. Chen, please stand and tell me in your own words how your recent life changes relate to your goals as a father. Marcus stood slowly, his heart pounding as he faced the judge who held Emma's future in her hands. He'd rehearsed this moment during sleepless nights, preparing arguments about rehabilitation and stability and his commitment to being the father Emma deserved. But standing there under Judge Harrison's direct gaze, he found himself speaking from the heart instead of from his prepared script. Your Honor, everything I've done over the past 8 months has been focused on becoming the kind of man Emma can be proud to call her father. The night shift maintenance job wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work that allowed me to pay my bills and demonstrate reliability. When I was offered a position in corporate security, I took it because it meant better pay, better hours, and the chance to use skills that had been dormant since my business failed. He paused, gathering his thoughts as he tried to find words for experiences that felt too complex for legal language. My relationship with Victoria Hartwell and her daughter began when I pulled Sophie out of a pond where she was drowning. I didn't know who she was, didn't know her mother owned the company where I worked. I just saw a child in danger and reacted the way any decent person would react. The friendship that developed afterward has been one of the most positive influences in my life since my divorce. Marcus looked directly at Sarah for the first time since entering the courtroom, seeing something in her expression that might have been pain or regret or simply exhaustion. I know I made terrible mistakes during our marriage, he continued. I know I let my failures as a businessman turn me into someone Emma shouldn't have had to see, someone who scared his own daughter with his anger and desperation. But I've spent every day since then trying to become better, trying to rebuild not just my financial stability, but my emotional stability as well. He turned back to Judge Harrison, his voice steadying as he found his center. "Sophie trusts me because children have good instincts about people who will protect them. Emma trusted me once too, before I broke that trust with my anger and my fear. Everything I'm doing now is about earning that trust back, about becoming someone worthy, of being her father." Judge Harrison made notes as he spoke, her expression thoughtful but unreadable. When Marcus sat down, she shuffled through the papers before her for several minutes, the courtroom silent except for the whisper of turning pages and the distant sounds of city traffic beyond the windows. "Mrs. Chen," she said finally, addressing Sarah directly, "what specific harm do you believe your daughter faces from her father's current circumstances?" Sarah stood slowly, and for the first time that morning, she looked directly at Marcus. Her eyes held years of accumulated hurt, disappointment, and fear that their daughter would be damaged by the same patterns that had destroyed their marriage. "I'm afraid he's repeating the same mistakes, Your Honor, getting involved with people and situations that he can't handle, making impulsive decisions based on emotion rather than careful thought. Emma needs stability, predictability, someone she can count on to be the same person every time she sees him. Has he demonstrated inconsistency during his supervised visits?" Sarah hesitated, and Marcus could see her struggle between her desire to protect Emma and her commitment to honesty. "No, Your Honor. The visits have been positive. Emma looks forward to them, talks about her father during the week, asks when she can see him again." "Then what is your specific concern about his current circumstances?" "I'm concerned that he's getting emotionally involved with another single mother and her child when he should be focusing on his relationship with his own daughter. I'm concerned that his job situation is unstable, that he's making impulsive career moves without considering the long-term implications." Judge Harrison nodded thoughtfully, then turned her attention to the stack of documents that included Marcus's employment records, psychological evaluations, and visitation reports. "I've reviewed all the evidence presented today," she said, "and I want to be clear about what I see here. Mr. Chen saved a child's life, was offered a better job based on his demonstrated character and capabilities, and has maintained consistent, positive contact with his daughter throughout this process. While I understand Mrs. Chen's concerns about stability and priorities, I don't see evidence of behavior that poses a risk to Emma's well-being." Marcus felt his knees weaken with relief, but Judge Harrison wasn't finished. "However, I am concerned about the adversarial nature of these proceedings and the impact they're having on Emma. This child has already been through her parents' divorce, has had to adjust to a complicated custody arrangement, and is now witnessing ongoing legal battles that paint her father as either a hero or a threat, depending on which lawyer is speaking." She set down her papers and looked directly at both parents. "I'm going to make a decision that I hope will serve Emma's best interests, while also acknowledging the progress Mr. Chen has made. The supervised visits will continue as scheduled, but I'm also ordering both parents to participate in family mediation with a focus on reducing conflict and improving communication. If that process is successful, we'll revisit the possibility of unsupervised visits in 3 months rather than 6. The ruling was better than Marcus had dared to hope for, but he could see that it wasn't what Sarah had wanted. She'd come to court expecting to see his visitation rights suspended, to have her fears about his instability validated by legal authority. Instead, she was being asked to work with him toward a solution that would benefit Emma rather than punish Marcus for his attempts to rebuild his life. As the courtroom cleared, Sarah approached Marcus hesitantly, her lawyer having already left to prepare for his next case. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I want you to know that I didn't do this to hurt you. I did it because I'm scared. Scared that Emma will get attached to someone who might disappear from her life the way her father disappeared from mine. The admission was more honest than anything they'd shared since the divorce proceedings began. Marcus could see the exhaustion in her face, the weight of being a single mother trying to protect her daughter from disappointments she might not be able to control. "I'm not going anywhere, Sarah," Marcus said gently. "Not from Emma's life, and not from my responsibilities as her father. The job change, the friendship with Victoria and Sophie, those aren't distractions from being Emma's dad. They're part of becoming the kind of person who deserves to be her dad." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, perhaps looking for the man she'd married rather than the one she'd divorced. "She talks about you differently now," she said finally. "More like you're her hero again, instead of someone she has to be careful around. I want that for her, Marcus. I want her to have a father she can admire." "So do I," Marcus said, "more than anything." The drive back to Hartwell Industries gave Marcus time to process what had happened in court, to feel the relief settle into his bones like warm honey. The supervised visits would continue. Emma would still be part of his life, and there was hope for something better in the near future. But more than that, he'd stood up for himself in court, had articulated who he was becoming rather than simply defending who he'd been. Victoria was waiting in his office when he returned, her expression anxious as she searched his face for signs of how the hearing had gone. "Well?" she asked simply. "The visits continue," Marcus said, allowing himself to smile for the first time that day. Judge Harrison saw through the accusations, recognized them for what they were. Victoria's relief was immediate and visible, her professional composure giving way to genuine emotion. "Thank God," she said. "I've been worried all morning that somehow our friendship had made things worse for you." "It almost did," Marcus admitted. "But in the end, I think it actually helped. I was able to talk about the kind of man I'm becoming instead of just defending the mistakes I've made." They were interrupted by Sophie's voice in the hallway, clearly having escaped from the after-school program that brought her to the office when Victoria's schedule ran late. "Mommy, is Marcus here? I made him a picture." Sophie burst into the office with the boundless energy of a 7-year-old who had important news to share. She was clutching a piece of construction paper covered in crayon drawings that appeared to show 3 stick figures standing beside a blue oval that probably represented the pond. "I drew the day you saved me," she announced, holding up the picture proudly. "That's you, and that's me, and that's Mommy, and that's Mr. Buttons floating in the water." The drawing was enthusiastic rather than accurate, but Marcus could see the story it told. The stick figure representing him was significantly larger than the others, drawn with yellow crayon that might have been intended to represent heroism, or simply the fact that Sophie had run out of brown. "It's beautiful, Sophie," Marcus said, accepting the artwork with the solemnity it deserved. "I'll put it up in my office so I can see it every day." "Really? You'll keep it forever?" "I'll keep it forever," Marcus promised, and realized as he spoke that he meant it. This drawing, created by a child who saw him as someone worth celebrating, represented everything he'd been trying to rebuild in his life. Victoria watched the exchange with tears in her eyes, clearly moved by the easy affection between Marcus and her daughter. "Sophie," she said gently, "would you like to invite Marcus to dinner again this week? I think we owe him a celebration." "Yes," Sophie exclaimed, bouncing on her toes. "Can we have cake? And can Emma come too? I want to meet her." The suggestion caught both adults off guard. Marcus looked at Victoria, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her expression. The idea of bringing Emma into this circle, of letting his 2 worlds intersect, felt both thrilling and terrifying. "I'd like that," Marcus said carefully. "If it's okay with Emma's mother, if the timing works out with the visitation schedule." "I'll call Sarah," Victoria said. Mother to mother, woman to woman. Sometimes these conversations go better without lawyers involved. That evening, Marcus sat in his apartment looking at Sophie's drawing, which he'd taped to his refrigerator, next to a photo of Emma from her last birthday. The image of the two pictures side by side struck him as symbolic somehow, representing the past he was trying to heal and the future he was trying to build. His phone rang, Sarah's name appearing on the screen. For the first time in months, he answered without dread. "Marcus," Sarah said, her voice lighter than he'd heard it since before their marriage fell apart. "I just got off the phone with Victoria Hartwell. She invited Emma to have dinner with her and Sophie this Saturday. What did you tell her?" "I told her yes," Sarah said, and Marcus could hear the smile in her voice. "Emma's been asking about the little girl whose life you saved. She wants to meet her hero's hero, apparently." The phrase made Marcus laugh, a sound that felt rusty from disuse, but genuine. "How do you feel about that?" he asked. "I feel like maybe it's time to stop being scared of you building a life that makes you happy," Sarah said. "Emma deserves to see her father as someone who saves people, someone who has friends who love him, someone who's more than just the sum of his mistakes." Nay, that Saturday evening, Marcus found himself back in Victoria's living room, but this time Emma was beside him on the couch, chattering excitedly with Sophie about school and friends and the elaborate games they'd invented during dinner. The two girls had bonded immediately, with the instant friendship that children could form when adult complications didn't get in the way. Victoria was in the kitchen cleaning up, but Marcus could see her watching the girls play with the same expression he imagined was on his own face. Wonder at how naturally his broken pieces were fitting together into something that looked like wholeness. "Daddy," Emma said, climbing into his lap with the casual affection that had been missing from their supervised visits. "Sophie says you're the bravest person she knows." "Sophie's very kind," Marcus said, smoothing Emma's hair with a gesture that felt both familiar and precious. "Are you brave, Daddy?" Marcus looked around the room, at Emma safe in his arms, at Sophie showing Victoria an elaborate block tower, at the evidence of a life being rebuilt through courage and connection and the willingness to believe in second chances. "I'm learning to be," he said finally. "Every day, I'm learning to be." Later, after Emma had returned to Sarah's house, full of stories about her new friend and plans for future playdates, Marcus and Victoria sat on her back deck, looking out over the city lights. The October air was crisp but not cold, carrying the promise of winter but not its bite. "Thank you," Marcus said simply. "For what?" "For seeing me as someone worth saving before I remembered how to save myself." Victoria reached over and took his hand, her fingers warm against his skin. "That's what people do for each other," she said. "They hold on until the drowning stops." Marcus thought about the night he'd pulled Sophie from the pond, about the moment when his life had changed direction based on nothing more than the instinct to help someone in need. He thought about the ripples that had spread from that single act, the job, the friendship, the chance to become someone Emma could admire again. "I love you," he said, the words surprising him with their simplicity and truth. Victoria smiled, her face radiant in the glow of the porch lights. "I love you too," she said. "All of us do. Sophie, me, even Emma, I think. We're your family now, Marcus. The one you chose and the one that chose you back." 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same family courtroom where he'd once fought to maintain supervised visits with his daughter. This time, Judge Harrison was reviewing his petition for joint custody, the legal documents that would formalize what had already become reality through the slow, careful work of rebuilding trust. Emma sat in the gallery between Sarah and Victoria, the three of them having formed an unlikely alliance based on their shared commitment to Emma's well-being. Sophie was there too, having convinced her mother that court proceedings were educational and therefore worthy of missing school. "Mr. Chen," Judge Harrison said, "I've reviewed your progress over the past year, and I'm impressed by the stability you've achieved. Your employment record is exemplary, your housing situation is stable, and most importantly, your relationship with Emma has developed into exactly the kind of bond this court hoped to see." She signed the custody modification papers with the same careful attention she brought to all her decisions. "Joint custody is granted, effective immediately. Mr. Chen, you'll have Emma for alternating weeks during the school year and extended periods during summer vacation. I trust you understand the responsibility this represents." "I do, Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. After the hearing, the unusual extended family celebrated. At a restaurant Emma had chosen, a kid-friendly place with arcade games and pizza that prioritized joy over sophistication. Marcus watched Emma and Sophie playing together, watched Sarah and Victoria discussing school fundraisers with the easy camaraderie of mothers who shared common ground, and felt grateful for the strange path that had led him here. "Daddy," Emma said, climbing into his lap as they waited for dessert, "Sophie says you and Ms. Victoria are getting married." The announcement caused a moment of silence at the table, all the adults looking at Sophie, who was grinning with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully delivered important news. "Sophie," Victoria said carefully, "we talked about not announcing things that haven't been decided yet." "But you have the ring in your purse," Sophie pointed out with 7-year-old logic, "and Marcus has been looking at it every time you're not watching." Marcus felt his cheeks burn as Victoria's eyes widened with surprise and amusement. "You've been looking at rings?" she asked. "I've been thinking about a lot of things," Marcus said carefully, aware that this conversation was happening in front of their daughters and Emma's mother. Things like family and commitment and what it means to build something lasting. Sarah cleared her throat gently. "Girls, why don't you go play some more arcade games? I think the adults need to have a grown-up conversation." As the children scampered away, Sarah turned to Marcus and Victoria with an expression that was both amused and serious. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think Emma would be thrilled to have Sophie as a sister and Victoria as a stepmother. And I think you've both earned the right to be happy." Victoria reached across the table and took Marcus's hand, her engagement ring catching the restaurant's fluorescent lights as she smiled. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to what?" Marcus asked, though he already knew. "Yes to everything. The proposal you haven't asked yet, the family we're already building, the life we're choosing together." Marcus looked around the table at the people who had become his anchor in the world. Emma chattering excitedly with Sophie at the arcade games, Sarah smiling with genuine warmth for the first time since their divorce, Victoria glowing with happiness that reflected his own. Sometimes the smallest acts of courage ripple outward in ways no one could predict. A split-second decision to dive into dark water had become a new life. A second chance, a family built on the foundation of people who chose to save each other every single day. As they left the restaurant that evening, Emma's hand in his and Sophie riding on his shoulders, Marcus Chen understood that heroes weren't people who rescued others from drowning. Heroes were people who learned how to breathe underwater, who figured out how to turn the depths into a place where love could grow. The pond at Hartwell Industries still reflected the sky like a mirror, but now it was surrounded by safety features, motion sensors, emergency phones, better lighting for the paths that led to its edge. Marcus passed it every morning on his way to work, and every morning he remembered the night that changed everything. Not the rescue itself, but the moment afterward when a 7-year-old girl had looked at him with absolute trust and called Him, her hero. That trust had saved them all, had rippled outward through corporate offices and family courts and carefully guarded hearts until it created something none of them could have imagined alone. Sometimes salvation came through grand gestures and dramatic rescues, but more often it came through showing up, staying present, and choosing each day to be worthy of the trust that someone else had placed in your hands. Marcus Chen had learned to be worthy. And in learning that, he had discovered that being someone's hero was less about the moment of rescue and more about what you chose to build in all the quiet moments that came after. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.